you eliminate any departments?
Oh, absolutely. Department of Environmental. I mean, the DEP is killing us environmentally. It's just killing our business.
The history of environmental regulation has many of the same challenges we've seen in other products liability, naming a problem and fighting about who's responsible. Throughout the early 20th century, the United States was at its height of industrialization and also its height of a nature blame frame. Rapid industrial expansion led to increasingly polluted cities, and a post-war economy led to a 50s trend where those who could afford it escaped the big city for greener pastures. A dispositionist lens wasn't concerned with those who stayed. While the city may be polluted, there were closer jobs, and one could choose between the two. With growing inequality and the erosion of a nature choice blame frame, situationism reached its height in the 60s. For the environmental movement, this started with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962. Over the next 8 years, industries such as DuPont would fight to discredit Carson, but they couldn't fight the growing power of situationism. In 1963, the Clean Air Act was passed, and in 1970, President Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency. 2 years later, we protected our rivers and streams with the Clean Water Act. These actions helped address the growing pollution we could see and feel in our rivers and air. The fight against climate change, with a more tenuous causal connection, would have its own challenges. Since the late 1970s, scientists have been studying the potentially disastrous effects of greenhouse gases, specifically carbon. But carbon, unlike other pollutants, is natural and essential to our energy industry. Naomi Oreskes' pivotal 2010 book, Merchants of Doubt, compared the oil industry to another, much like the tobacco industry's response to the Big Scare, employing doctors to question the connection between smoking and lung cancer. The oil industry created doubt over the causal connection between carbon and climate change by employing out-of-work nuclear World War II scientists to create controversy. In many ways, they succeeded. Only in 2007, almost 40 years since the first empirical studies connecting carbon to climate change, and 30 years after a near scientific consensus was reached, the Supreme Court forced the EPA to regulate greenhouse gases in their landmark decision, Massachusetts v. EPA. This led to the endangerment finding. The EPA's endangerment finding finally established a causal connection between carbon and climate change, but a citizen's cause of action to hold companies responsible still eludes us. In 2011, the Supreme Court decided American Electric Power v. Connecticut. Citing efficiency concerns, the unanimous decision barred a cause of action against corporations for carbon emissions because, with the endangerment finding, the Clean Air Act delegated all carbon regulation to the EPA. Numerous studies espouse the conventional wisdom that, to address such a large and complex issue, the expertise of agencies, rather than the passions of citizens, was the most efficient regulatory answer. Not everyone entirely agrees. For the first few years after Massachusetts v. EPA, progress was made, albeit slowed by usual agency bureaucracy. Certain agency heads may be strongly influenced by the same industry they regulate, but this theory of normal regulatory capture is justified as a way to maintain balanced perspectives between public and private interest and ultimately achieve the most efficient outcome. But regulatory capture is no longer normal. Donald Trump has appointed former Oklahoma Attorney General Scott Pruitt, a longtime adversary of the EPA, to head the agency. In his short time in office, Pruitt has begun to either move, delay, or block over 30 environmental regulations aimed at protecting public health. A CNN investigation found that, among Pruitt's meetings as head of the EPA, 25% have been with industry representatives, while only 1% have been with scientists and environmental groups. Appealing to the coal industry, he has stated that he will employ climate skeptic scientists in an adversarial approach to challenge the scientific consensus of the endangerment finding. Pruitt hopes to create doubt that carbon should ever have been regulated at all. This begs the question, what alternatives do we have? We reached out to Tessa Kahn of Urgenda, a Dutch public interest NGO focused on climate-related litigation. Her organization filed, and won, the historic climate change lawsuit Urgenda v. the Netherlands. In June 2015, the Hague District Court ordered the national government to observe a minimum carbon emissions reduction target set by Urgenda, and while this case is on appeal, the political impact has led to huge changes in Dutch climate change policy, including a new commitment by the government, which would have been unthinkable before the case was filed. But is this possible in the United States? What institutional barriers might we have that Europe does not? According to Tessa, there's no real advantage presented by the legal systems in Europe over the US. There's a wider range of human rights and environmental justice-related provisions in Europe, but the Dutch case didn't rely on those rights. Instead, they based their arguments in tort law. And indeed, this is what we've seen in the US since the EPA's environmental rollbacks. The courts have steadily been more clogged by climate-related tort cases, at least triple the number in 2014. Tessa is hopeful and believes that the sheer number of cases shows that this kind of litigation in the U.S. is certainly possible. With so many cases in court, there is bound to be one success, and this may create a dangerous precedent for the U.S. oil industry. If the courts really are interested in efficiency and balancing private and public interests, is an ever-changing stance from the EPA really the answer? If the EPA dismisses the endangerment finding, this could further open the possibility of clogging the courts with climate-related litigation, not just against the EPA, but private industry as well. Instead of clear, consistent guidelines to give notice and allow the energy industry and its workers to appropriately respond, they are given false promises by an agency drowned in politics. People are standing up to say enough. Hopefully, the courts will respond to this unrest and hold the EPA to the public standard. Assuming they do, we may move one step closer to avoiding the negative externalities of industry capture. The next step, of course, will be to address the distributional impacts of climate change. Those most affected by increasingly violent storms and sea level rise will be minorities and the poor. Will we ever genuinely expand our scope of justice to include them? Maybe the unresponsiveness of the EPA and the courts is necessary to enrage the public and open tort litigation up to the clear distributional answer, a cause of action holding private industry accountable.